In 1963, a former butcher convinced some of the biggest names on Wall Street, American Express included, to hand over hundreds of millions of dollars in loans, backed by tanks of vegetable oil that were almost entirely full of seawater. His name was Tino De Angelis, and for years, nobody thought to check what was actually inside those tanks. Because on paper, everything checked out perfectly. Tino ran a company called Allied Crude Vegetable Oil, based out of Bayonne, New Jersey. His business bought and stored massive quantities of soybean and cottonseed oil, then used that stored oil as collateral to borrow money he'd use to buy even more oil, and to speculate heavily on the futures market. It was a system built entirely on trust in one document: the warehouse receipt. A warehouse receipt was supposed to be a guarantee. A third-party inspector would check a storage tank, confirm exactly how much oil was inside, and issue a certificate banks could rely on as collateral. American Express ran one of the biggest warehousing operations in the country, and their name on a receipt was as good as gold to any lender. Tino figured out how to make that guarantee worthless without anyone noticing. His tanks weren't secretly empty. They were secretly full of water. Oil floats on top of water, and it doesn't mix. So when an inspector lowered a measuring stick into a tank to check the contents, the stick came up coated in oil every single time. Because the top few feet genuinely were oil. Underneath that thin layer sat thousands of gallons of plain seawater, and nobody was measuring deep enough, or thoroughly enough, to notice the difference. Some tanks had false compartments built directly into them. Others had the same barrels of oil counted more than once, shuffled between locations right before each inspection. On paper, Allied claimed to be storing more vegetable oil than existed in the entire United States. Nobody added it up until it was far too late. With warehouse receipts in hand, Tino borrowed against oil that mostly didn't exist, and used the cash to buy up soybean and cottonseed oil futures contracts. At one point controlling roughly 90% of all the cottonseed oil contracts traded on the New York Produce Exchange. He was trying to corner the entire market, betting that prices would keep climbing and cover for everything underneath. For a while, it worked. Then, in late 1963, an expected export deal with the Soviet Union stalled in the U.S. Senate, and demand for soybean oil didn't rise the way Tino had bet it would. Futures prices dropped instead. Lenders issued margin calls Allied couldn't meet, and for the first time, banks and exchange officials started asking pointed questions about exactly how much oil was actually sitting in those tanks. Inspectors went back to Bayonne, this time checking properly. They found what should have been impossible: measuring sticks that came up wet with something other than oil. Tanks with far less product than any receipt claimed, and in some cases, nothing but seawater beneath the surface. On November 19, 1963, Allied Crude Vegetable Oil filed for bankruptcy. The collapse rippled outward almost instantly. 2 Wall Street brokerage firms went under. American Express alone absorbed tens of millions of dollars in losses, and the New York Produce Exchange, the very marketplace built around trading this oil, effectively ceased to exist within a few years. American Express stock collapsed in the panic that followed, and in the middle of that collapse, a young investor named Warren Buffett looked at the wreckage and made a bet that most people at the time thought was reckless. Buying up a large stake in American Express while everyone else was selling, convinced the core business was still sound even if this one warehousing subsidiary had been badly fooled. It became one of the defining early trades of his career. Tino De Angelis was arrested, charged with 19 counts of fraud and conspiracy, and eventually sentenced to federal prison. He served about 7 years. Every bank involved had done exactly what they were supposed to do. They checked the paperwork. They sent inspectors. The inspectors dipped their measuring sticks into the tanks, and every single time, the sticks came up covered in oil. Nobody thought to ask how deep the tank actually went. If you were the inspector standing at the top of that tank, watching oil drip off your own measuring stick, would you have asked to check any deeper?